Welcome to the Indiana Wetland Advocacy Preservation and Restoration webinar. My name is Emily Wood. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Wildlife Federation. We are co-hosting this event, of course, with the Hoosier Environmental Council. If you don't know, IWF has been around for about 80 years. We work on promoting conservation and healthy habitats across Indiana through education, advocacy, and action. And hopefully we're going to do all three of those things here tonight. So let's get started. As many of you know, the Indiana General Assembly passed SEA 389 this past year, which significantly reduced protection for Indiana's remaining wetlands. So today we're here with experts and advocates to discuss the ways that we can work together towards healthy and protected wetland habitats here in Indiana. So after all of the speakers that we have here this afternoon, we will have time for a Q&A at the end. Just to keep our feed stable, we do have a lot of people joining us today. We'll ask that everyone remains on mute and also keep your videos off if you're not a presenter. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask of the specific panelists, you can put those in the chat. Jenny and myself will be watching the chat for your questions to come through. If you're joining us live on a Facebook or on a live stream, we will try to catch comments as well. So if you have questions on any of those other streaming platforms, you can put questions in the comments and we'll try to get those as well. So we will have Q&A at the end with the panelists. If there are still questions, a lot of questions and dialogue going on at 5 o'clock when we're supposed to wrap up, we'll go into sort of a sudden death overtime, wetlands overtime. We will take questions probably until about 5:15, but we will be sending a follow-up email to this event. So we'll address any unanswered questions that we don't get to. We'll send around links to this recorded event. And we'll also send a link to the Wetlands webinar that was hosted by the White River Alliance and Purdue University on October 5th. It was a really great webinar. That covers really how wetlands function ecologically and then how the recently passed SEA 389 wetland policy will be applied by our regulatory agencies and natural resource managers. So it was really a lot of information in that webinar, and we'll include a link to that as well. Additionally, we'll probably be hosting an event after this one in January, after we see how the Indiana Legislature and the governor's newly appointed Wetlands Task Force have had a little bit of time to take shape. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pass over to my friend and colleague, John Goss. He is the policy chair for the Indiana Wildlife Federation Board. John, take it away.
Thanks. I just want to make a couple of points now. I'll introduce our first speaker. About 20 years ago, when I was the DNR director, INDOT was building Interstate 69 across southern Indiana. Had to cross a lot of streams, wetland areas, and therefore they were paying funds into a mitigation fund. And fortunately, that fund had several $1 million in it when the Goose Pond property came up for sale. So Goose Pond happened really because we had a well-funded DNR mitigation fund. Second point I want to make is last January, during the testimony by the Indiana home builders on Senate Bill 389, the speakers were extremely negative about DNR's in lieu of fee program. So I think it's a special challenge to us to educate our legislators on the critical value of the DNR wetland mitigation restoration program that Carl's going to talk to us about next. Carl Wodrich is the assistant director of DNR's Division of Land Acquisition and has been a DNR for about 15 years. Carl led the project development team creating the statewide in lieu fee program, working with NDOT and IDEM, and Carl is still the manager of that program for DNR. So Carl, help us all understand better how DNR is using mitigation funds.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me come and talk to you about this program. It's a difficult program to talk about in 12 minutes, but I'm going to try. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully everybody can see my slide. We do have a static link for information about our program, sort of how it works, and links to some of our annual reports that we've put out the last 3 years that we've had the program in operation. So if you go to that link, no matter what DNR does to our actual web addresses, that link will always take you to our program's website, no matter what changes happen in the background. So, so as John said, we have an in lieu fee program that was approved back in May of 2018. We sold our first credit at the end of September in 2018. So we really just had about 3 years of credit sales. So what is an in lieu fee mitigation program? Sorry, my navigation's not working. Hold on one second. Apologies. There we go. An in lieu fee program is where restoration, establishment, enhancement, or preservation of aquatic resources, wetlands, and streams are done through funds paid to either a government agency or an NGO organization, such as a land trust that has a natural resource management, mission statements. Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited are some of the other program sponsors across the country, in addition to state agencies. So the permittee purchases credits that are available through an in lieu fee sponsor that's gone through the process to receive approval from the Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, and state agencies that make up what's called an interagency review team. So an in lieu fee sponsor, the DNR, we are selling credits that we refer to as advance credits because we're selling them in advance of putting mitigation on the ground. So we take these funds and pool them in what we call service areas. I'll explain that a little bit more. And we go ahead and build and maintain larger mitigation projects than what typically has been done in Indiana and most places across the country that don't have an in lieu fee program or a mitigation bank, where those are done on a permittee responsible basis. Each individual project that's permitted has to have a mitigation project if there's no in lieu fee program or wetland mitigation bank. And so these programs, in lieu fee programs, have to follow the 2008 federal mitigation rule, and then we also have to adhere to our approved program instrument for our specific program as well. So the permits involved are permits under Section 10 and Section 404 of the Harbors Act and Clean Water Act for Army Corps of Engineers, and then Section 401 water quality certifications that IDEM issues, as well as we have approval for our program in Indiana to also provide mitigation credit for the state isolated wetland law. And then we have sort of a similar sister program, if you will, for our Division of Water construction and floodway permits that we issue. All the funds are separate and it's kind of done separately, but we do have an in lieu fee option for those permits as well. So the other sources I alluded to for mitigation, in addition to in lieu fee programs, are mitigation banks. Mitigation banks have a higher priority as far as if a mitigation bank exists in that part of the state, and there's the type of credits available that somebody needs. The Corps and EPA and IDEM would prefer, those credits are purchased because a mitigation bank builds their site in advance of selling credits. So they have to actually do some work on the ground before they have credits that are available to sell to folks. And those are called released credits. Permittee responsible mitigation, again, is just those individual projects constructed by the permittee themselves. So, and they're doing those, in the county or at least in the 8-digit watershed. Sometimes it's within a smaller, 11 or 14-digit watershed, depending on the impacts and the permit requirements. And then our program, again, is selling advanced credits. Each project that we will put on the ground will produce what are called release credits, similar to a mitigation bank, but our released credits will go to fulfill the advanced credits that we have already sold and received funds for. So the purpose and benefits of the program, these are the 11 service areas that we've divided Indiana up into. They're watershed based, also based on, ecoregions and ecological significance. So some of the benefits of the program are that it provides specific costs of mitigation for permit applicants, including the Department of Transportation, shortens timeframes for permitting and overall project timeframes too for them, reduces those national average permitting timelines. The source for this information came from Army Corps of Engineers and EPA. So if there's an LEP program that exists, that permit timeframe is about 136 days to get your 404 permit versus 243 days for permittee responsible mitigation. The other benefits of the program is that being the DNR, we can integrate this program into some of our other conservation efforts and pool our in lieu fee money to some extent, coordinate with other programs within DNR, within our Division of Fish and Wildlife and nature preserves and whatnot to do these bigger, better projects across the state. And then lastly, by the fact that we're pooling folks' money within these service areas, we're able to gain efficiencies, put conservation on the ground, mitigation on the ground that has a greater ecological significance, because we've had to go through about a 5-year process to get our instrument and what's called our compensation planning framework document approved. And that planning framework sort of outlines how we're prioritizing projects. So the way that the program works is it doesn't really change anything with the way permitting works. It's just changing what your mitigation is. So, folks still have to avoid, minimize, and come up to an agreed amount of, authorized impacts that the Corps and IDEM are willing to allow to be permitted. And then they come up with whatever that mitigation requirement is. So, with our program now, those permits are issued with a condition that they purchase X number of wetland and or stream credits and the different types of credits for the type of impact that they are allowing. So once folks who receive their permits, they can come to us and then we will sell them the credits that they need. And then we produce a receipt and a credit sale letter that goes to the permittee, but also is sent over to the regulators as well at the Corps and IDEM. And then their permit is in compliance and they fulfilled their mitigation requirements, and that requirement transfers over to the DNR. Like I said, we have a lot of information on sort of the detailed process of the credit sale purchase and all the other components of the program that I'm not going to get into a whole lot. But I do want to explain a little bit about sort of where the money goes. So we sell a credit or credits. Where does that funding go? 15% goes into our administrative fund to pay for staff, equipment, vehicles, overtime, all the administrative costs associated with operating this program. Another 15% we put into a reserve fund that is utilized for financial assurances. So if we have some issue with a mitigation site or a site floods and we have to do some revegetation, replanting of some trees and or shrubs, we have the funding to do that. And also that reserve fund will be the place where we put long-term management funds as well. And then the remaining 70% goes into the individual service area fund for design, construction, monitoring, and maintenance of the sites over time. And mainly that work is being done by contractors. And so we have an admin fund because in lieu fee programs are not supposed to, provide any state or other funding to subsidize somebody's required mitigation. So we have to have what's called a full cost accounting for our mitigation prices that we're charging per credit. So full cost accounting includes real estate, engineering, designing, plan development, project management, the financial assurance, as I mentioned, the actual construction of the site, and then monitoring and maintenance for 5 to 10 years, depending on the project, as well as long-term management, any contingencies in that administrative cost as well. So we did a whole lot of work to try and come up with these costs. This was probably the most difficult part of the program development, quite honestly. We have a range of prices. For the most part, most of our stream credits are about $400 a credit. And a stream credit is equivalent to 1 linear foot of stream where you're restoring both banks with, a 50 to 100 foot buffer, as well as doing some in-channel work. And then the wetland credit prices, for the most part, are $80,000 per credit, a couple higher prices in a couple service areas. And again, the wetland credit equivalent is an acre of wetland full restoration. And then our floodway credits are currently at the same price. And so we did a lot of work to try and figure out how many credits should we be asking for. We have to have an allotment of those advanced credits because it's kind of like a revolving line of credit, like a credit card. We get a certain amount of credits that we're allowed to sell that we came up with and requested. And as we sell them, we have to put projects on the ground, and those produce released credits, which then fulfill those advanced credits we sold. So it's sort of like a revolving balance. So about 90 in most of the service areas for wetland credits, 45,000 for stream credits. Again, a few of these are higher based on, and when we did all of this looking at some historical mitigation data from Army Corps of Engineers and IDEM over a certain time period that kind of captured both really good economic time and the downturn in the economy that we saw not too long ago. So that compensation planning framework is really sort of what drives and justifies our projects to the Corps and EPA and IDEM and Fish and Wildlife Service. There's a statewide prioritization strategy. Number one is we have to replace the lost functions and services that were authorized to be impacted. Second to that is, we're prioritizing reestablishment and rehabilitation over establishment, enhancement, and preservation. So we want to do projects where we're actually increasing, the number of acres and linear feet of stream and wetland and aquatic resources. An additional prioritization would be is the project site within or adjacent to other priority conservation areas, whether they're the DNRs, the states, or some of our conservation partners like the Nature Conservancy. And then finally, are we addressing any identified threats within the watershed or within that service area based on TMDLs or watershed management plans that have been produced for that particular watershed? So, and each service area has a more specific set of priorities that are more specific to that service area. And to get these projects approved, we have to go through a process called the letter of permission process with the Army Corps and the interagency review team. So we have to put together a concept plan, do a site visit, get some comments back, and then we can move that forward into design and permitting. And then ultimately the 404 permit that we receive and that approval becomes a modification to that program instrument that the Corps approved for us to operate as a in lieu fee program. We're just now navigating this process, so we'll see how the timeline actually works out, but there are some specific timeframes in here. And the one thing I should add that I forgot to mention is we do have the federal mitigation rule requires in lieu fee programs to produce to get mitigation, the initial sort of preservation of the property and start the initial, physical, biological, chemical improvements on the ground, essentially start construction within 3 growing seasons of when we sold that credit that's being fulfilled by that project. So it's a really tricky time frame to do that, especially for a state government agency when you're talking about a new program. We had to get money first of all, then you have to enter into contracts, and state contracting is not very fast. Talked about some of the benefits. A few that I haven't talked about is, benefits of in lieu fee over permitting responsible mitigation in a lot of ways is that, we're the DNR, and our conservation partners, are in it for the long haul. This is our mission is, wetland conservation, preservation, and long-term management of those resources. So, we're an easy one place to look for the regulators. If, they drive by a site and it's not performing well, they're going to come to us and say, hey, you haven't done X, Y, and Z, or are you addressing these issues? And we can, have that conversation. They don't have to go hunt somebody down that and go look through files if they know it's one of our in lieu fee sites. And our full cost accounting does include long-term maintenance. So every mitigation plan that we get approved will have to have a long-term management plan and a budget associated with that. And then at the end of our monitoring and maintenance period, before the Corps fully releases us, we have to have the funding in hand to actually, back up that budget and that plan. So I think the biggest challenge we're going to face in Indiana with the program is legal drains. We have to vacate at least the portion of a legal drain if we're going to do anything and get any credit within the drainage easement for that water body. So we are attempting to do that in Porter County on our first project up there. So far, it seems like we have the support to do that. So I'm looking forward to making that happen. And then I did mention we do have the DNR Division of Water permits and an in lieu fee program for that. I don't want to spend too much time on that. And with that, I think hopefully I have stayed pretty close to my 12 minutes.
Thanks, Carl.
Yep.
All right, remember you can put questions in the chat, or if you're on live stream, you can also put them in the comments. We'll try to catch them there. Up next, we're going to learn about the role of land trusts from Andrea Huntington. Andrea serves as the executive director for the Indiana Land Protection Alliance, also known as ILPA. She has a deep appreciation for Indiana's rich and diverse landscapes and values the work being accomplished by conservation organizations throughout the state to preserve and restore them. Andrea has a JD from Chicago-Kent College of Law and a BA in political science and English from Temple University. She's been active with the Indiana Land Trust community since 2017, following a rewarding career in the public sector. She has spent the past 4 years raising awareness and support for habitats and ecosystems along the southern Lake Michigan watershed and throughout northwestern Indiana. Andrea believes that the most relevant and important conservation work happens locally and values her role at ILPA, uniting and empowering Indiana's land trust. We value that too. Thanks, Andrea. Take it away.
Thanks, Emily. So as Emily mentioned, my name is Andrea. I'm the Executive Director for Indiana Land Protection Alliance, also known as ILPA. I'd just like to start by thanking Hoosier Environmental Council and Indiana Wildlife Federation for hosting today's event and having me here. ILPA is the statewide alliance for land trusts or land conservation organizations. Now, most people, and when I say most people, I'm talking about myself about 10 years ago, ask, what is a land trust? A land trust is a nonprofit organization that protects land and water for the public's benefit. Some land trusts protect agricultural or working lands, other really significant high quality natural areas, cultural resources, water corridors, just to name a few. Indiana has about 24 land trusts, which serve all 92 counties. And collectively, our land trusts have protected approximately 140,000 acres. Really, really beautiful and incredible places protected. Indiana's land trusts work within a very fragmented landscape. So if you live in Indiana or if you have driven through Indiana, you know that our state is cut by roadways and railways, private development, industry. So the work of our land trust, it's especially challenging and unique, but really all the more important. So land trusts, as Emily mentioned, they play a really vital role in protecting our wetlands. And so hopefully, without oversimplifying all that they do, I'll be sharing some of the specific ways that land trusts help to protect these rare and valuable ecosystems. And I'm not sure how to get to my next, oh, okay. Hopefully I didn't go through too many at once. So land trusts, they protect our wetlands really primarily in two ways. One, either by acquiring the land in fee simple, so actually taking ownership of the land or the wetlands, either by purchasing it or in some rare cases, the land is donated. They also can protect land through conservation easement. So that's where a land trust would work with a private landowner to place certain restrictions on the land. And as Carl kind of referenced, we're all in this forever business. So land trusts, when they protect the land, it's forever. So they think very carefully and strategically when they take on new projects and new acquisitions, because the work that they do, the management that they do, the restoration work, it's forever. And so the other way is land trusts do on occasion partner with agencies to help, certain government agencies sometimes acquire land that are, potentially adjacent to already existing protected areas, just because land trusts as nonprofits, sometimes they can make those acquisitions happen a little quicker than the agencies themselves. So a land trust, after they acquire the land, they restore it. So the wetlands in particular, they're really the boots on the ground. They're providing that expertise, that manpower that's needed to go in and, for example, remove trash. I know there are anyone who has volunteered with the land trust or works for a land trust or a natural area of any sort know that unfortunately nature preserves, wetlands in particular, have been thought of as really good dumping grounds. So our land trusts do go in and remove trash from the wetlands, are a big part of what they do. And then, as you can imagine, the invasive species management, so removing invasive plant species, restoring the health of the wetlands so that they are healthy, functioning ecosystems. And, just making sure that the plants and animals, especially the native plants, have a place to thrive. And, most people don't realize, but, wetlands, many of our wetlands that are protected have, cataloged over 500 plant species. So just really amazing places, and our land trusts, they put in a lot of time and resources to nurture these lands back to, healthy, functioning ecosystems. Another way that land trusts restore wetlands is by actually going in and reestablishing wetlands. An example of, and actually, I should mention too, one of my favorite, well, not favorite, but most people on the call may know about Phragmites, which is an invasive plant species that a lot of are found in a lot of wetlands here in Indiana. They're awful, awful, awful plants. And if you Google an image of them, now that I've told you about them, I promise you will not be able to stop staring at them while you're driving down the road or seeing a wetland that, is potentially not being managed or not being cared for. So, but that's just one of the battles that our land trusts deal with. Our land trusts also go in and they restore wetlands by reestablishing them. And so that's basically constructing wetlands in areas, particularly in areas where they once existed. A good example is one of our land trusts, Little River Wetlands Project, their Eagle Marsh Nature Preserve, that is located on the southwest border of Fort Wayne. It's actually the largest urban inland wetland restoration in the United States. It's 831 acres. Another example, I have the two photos to the right. The one to the far right is a before, and the photo in the middle is an after photo of Niches Land Trust Fisher Oak Savannah Nature Preserve. So this was 49 acres that sits adjacent to a state dedicated nature preserve that was restored from a former agricultural field, as you can see, and restored back to a healthy wetland habitat. I know at least a couple of our land trusts, Red Tail Land Conservancy, Shirley Hines Land Trust, are working with Carl and the Department of Natural Resources with the hopes of enrolling some of their properties in the in lieu fee program. Again, just really thinking strategically with those projects, and also, I guess, as Carl mentioned, kind of prioritizing. Land trusts are doing the same thing. Just really taking into consideration flood storage, impacts to water quality, recreation opportunities, habitat expansion, all of the reasons why wetlands are important to us. Those are all things that land trusts take into consideration with their work. And then land trusts being throughout the state, they have that physical place for people to get outside and learn about our wetlands. And so that's also a really important role and function that our land trusts have in protecting wetlands. A lot of our organizations invest a significant amount of time and resources into education and outreach. Really getting all ages, working with school groups, having guided hikes, partnering with other organizations, getting folks out learning about wetlands, seeing them firsthand, and just experiencing them in a way that, you just can't without being there. Just providing those experiential learning opportunities and seeing the biodiversity, and so that's a really, really important role that our land trusts play. And I think I'm probably a little shorter than I had anticipated, but our land trusts are just doing such amazing work protecting our wetlands. And so each of you have a land trust in your community. And so if you're not already involved, or if you don't know about your land trust and the wetlands that they're protecting and really the other special places, I would encourage you to visit our website. We have a list of all of the land trusts by county. They love volunteers. They love getting people outside onto the preserves. And so there's just lots and lots of ways that you can become involved and support them and their work protecting wetlands. So I would encourage you each to do that. And that's all. Hopefully I left extra time for questions.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, we will take those questions at the end. So we are getting some questions in the chat. Next up, we have Beth Clarizia, and she's going to be talking about options for private property owners, which is a really big thing that we have here in Indiana. Of course, as Andrea was talking about, a lot of our property or a lot of our landscape is privately owned. And so Beth is going to talk to us about what private landowners can do to be more beneficial to wetlands. Beth graduated from The Ohio State University with a BS in agricultural engineering and spent over 20 years working for the NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. She works in planning, design, and construction of conservation engineering practices. Beth has been the Indiana Easement Program Manager since 2016, and in this role, she manages the legal, financial, and technical oversight for acquisition and restoration of about 35 easements every year, and the maintenance and monitoring of over 900 existing easements throughout the state. She enjoys being involved in really large, complicated wetland restoration projects where she can participate in the creative and technical aspects of the project planning. The United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service provides both wetland reserve easement and agricultural land easement options through Farm Bill funded programs. Beth?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to the Environmental Council for the invitation to talk about some of the federal options available for private landowners who are looking for ways that they can do some wetland restoration on their property. And so I'm going to talk just from the federal side And most of the items I'm going to talk about are NRCS related, but I'm going to mention a few other federal programs when we get later. So the federal programs that I work on as part of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is an agency of the Department of Agriculture. Our funding comes from the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill, Congress passes about every 5 years. It provides funding for our agency to do a lot of things. One of those things is wetland restoration and protection. So we have a program called the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. We've been working on this in Indiana since 1994, so over 25 years now of doing this. And so I'm going to explain more about the Wetland Reserve Easement Program and how landowners can get involved. So if you know someone who has who fits into these sort of categories, you can certainly let them know about this opportunity. So typically we are working with private landowners who have that really marginal crop ground that gets drowned out in wet years, low areas near the river where they try to farm it, but really they're not making a profit most years. And then some areas that were drained, but perhaps the tile drainage or the ditches have are in disrepair, and so the expense needed to upgrade those really is beyond what they want to continue to work with. So we have the Wetland Reserve Easement Program, which is completely voluntary, and we work on private lands and with NGOs and others to restore that land, which historically was a wetland, and then we protect it with either a permanent or a 30-year easement, and then we continue to monitor that every year, and we help to control invasive species. We do enhancements later if they're needed. Yes, the issue of the trash and the wetland dumping, I understand that as an issue too. So we have issues that, you know, we continue to monitor and look at for habitat on these wetlands. So our emphasis, it really is on the habitat for migratory birds and threatened and endangered species. So when we look at the project sites, the proposed sites, we do a ranking, and we're really looking for those good sites where threatened and endangered species can benefit and the habitat can be restored. And then I'll explain how that permanent easement is purchased from the landowner. And then we also pay for all of the funding for the restoration and all of the legal and environmental work that has to happen along with these. So the criteria for someone to enter this program, the land has to, at least 50% of it has to be considered hydric soils. So hydric soils are those soils that historically were a wetland. The darker soils, they may be drained now, they may be dry now, but they were wet at some point. And then for the ag land value for the payments that we'll pay, it must have been farmed at some time in the past. We really have to take into consideration the size of the acreage, because this is quite a program. I know Carl went through all of the details of permitting and the financial, and just there are a lot of things that go into the engineering and the planning, the financials for a wetland. For us, for the benefit of the program, we have a minimum 15 acres set in order to get through all of that to make it really worth the habitat for the size of the property. So we do have a 15-acre minimum. There is no maximum. And then you need to have access, legal access to the site with a boundary that's easy to maintain. So occasionally there are landlocked properties a wet area in the middle of a farm that the landowner wants to put in, that's okay as long as they provide us an access route to get out to that easement area. And then landowners have to meet a certain qualification too. We have an annual gross income limit of $900,000 a year, and then they cannot have any violations, current violations with our programs. And then of course they have to own the property, and they have to be able to give us an easement on the property, which means that someone else can't own rights on it. So we do offer a 30-year easement in addition to the permanent easement option. We don't have many people who take the 30-year option, maybe a handful out of the 900 easements that we have. The way that an easement works, for those who don't know, the landowner retains ownership of that property. They still own it. They still manage who has the right to enter it, except that NRCS does have the right to enter it. And then we then own the rights to basically the surface vegetation, the ability to restore it. And we handle all the legal services, the engineering we hire the boundary survey done. We pay for all the restoration. And then on top of that, we pay the landowner a lump sum for that right to be able to restore and monitor the site. So the landowner still gets to own it, but what's the fine print? Well, the fine print is that there will be a warranty easement deed that has limitations and restrictions that the landowner can no longer build a house on that property. They can't cut the vegetation. They can't destroy any of the wetland or drain it or farm it any longer. So it has to remain in wetland habitat because that's what the easement is paying for. So that's what the landowner's really losing by getting that payment. That's what the money is paying for. Just a few shots of some of our wetlands. So many times the wetland ends up looking like this, big open water. We have a lot of duck hunters who want as much open water as they can get. Sometimes it's just a tiny little wet pocket at the edge of a field surrounded by woods, which this can be a very valuable wetland too, even though it is small. Again, the larger wetlands, we have tremendous habitat and response by birds and other species on the sites. And the heron is one of my favorites. See those all the time. And then I just wanted to mention that only 50% of the site has to be the hydric soils. So we often are taking in half the site that is upland or adjacent properties where we do something like these warm season grass plantings that you see here. We do tree plantings. We do lots of forbs, which are flowers for bees and monarch butterfly. We really try to make these sites as diverse as possible and include habitat where not only is there water for all the birds and amphibians and things that like the water, they have nesting and upland sites adjacent to that where they can live. So why are we doing this? So just a quick history. Of course, many of you know this, Indiana wetlands used to be about 24% of Indiana was a wetland. And then, of course, we have such fertile, wonderful farmland. When we came in, we drained it with tile and ditches so that we could farm it. And so this report was from IDNR based on the 1980s. And so in the 1980s, there was estimated 3.5% left in wetlands in Indiana, down from the 24% that we think was basically originally there. And so from that same report in the 1980s, this is kind of where the wetlands were left in the state. And you can see these areas up in here are kind of, I call kind of the pothole areas of Indiana, up in those dark soils. We have some Kankakee River area here, and of course the rivers that come down in the Muscatatuck area. And I'll show you that matches up pretty well with where we as NRCS have restored wetlands in the state of Indiana. All of these little blue dots are wetland reserve easements that we've restored in our under permanent easement in the state of Indiana. So we have over 80,000 acres now, 928 easements. So if you look back to the number of acres originally in wetland and what it came down to, basically these 80,000 are only an increase of 0.3% in our whole 25 years that we've been able to do. So although I feel that is a big impact, we were only able to increase it by 0.3%. And of course, we have no idea how much were lost in those 25 years. So we don't know overall if it's gone down significantly or come up a little bit. But this is what we've been able to do. And we do work a lot with partners. John mentioned in the beginning the Goose Pond area. So Goose Pond is our largest WRE easement in the state of Indiana at 7,000 acres. So we did put an easement on that and restore it and then sold it to the IDNR. And so they've been managing that property as public access property. It's been great. And then Andrea talked about the Eagle Marsh up in Allen County, and that's also a WRE easement that we restored and have worked with Little River Group on that. And they've been a great partner in having all the kids out there. And we love seeing the education that happens on that site. So often our sites are, the easement is put on when there's a private landowner, and then sometimes the government will, state government has purchased many of these, and land trusts are able to enter the program as well. So that's what we've been doing with these. So how much money does the landowner get? This is our map for FY22, fiscal year 22, that shows you basically for each of these regions how much money per acre a landowner would get as their one-time easement payment on an easement. So if you look, for example, up in the northwest part of the state, the first number is the ag land rate, and the second number is the non-ag land rate. Ag land rate would be considered cropland or pasture land, farmable land. The non-ag would be adjacent water, scrubby trees, non-farmable, rough land, edges of fields, that sort of thing would be in that category. So when we look at a property, we map it out and break it into those categories, and then it is officially surveyed by a professional licensed land surveyor who comes up with the actual acreage, and then that is the payment that they get. You see these values vary from area to area. We do have a professional appraiser do an area-wide market analysis to determine what these rates are in each of these areas. So let me give you a quick example. Here's a property. It's right up here where the red star is along the Kankakee River in LaPorte County. So it's under the 4,800 to 2160 rates. And they have 76 acres that would be considered that ag land rate here in the crop and pasture, and 22 acres that are over here non-farmable. Sometimes part of what they own is actually part of the river. And so we do end up making payments for areas along rivers and along in edges of rivers where the property deed shows that as their ownership. So here's what they would get. They have the 76 acres of ag land plus the 22 acres of non-ag land. That would be $412,000 as the easement payment to the landowner, basically to sell us the rights to then restore and monitor that site forever. So the forever sometimes is a thing that can catch people a little bit, but It takes us 1 to 2 years to get beyond from application to where we actually close on the easement and the landowner gets that money, because of course we have to go through a lot of legal and financial approvals and checks and title clearances and environmental review. And then once it closes, then we have our own engineering staff, biologists and planners and foresters and so forth. And we go out and work with the landowner and we come up with a restoration plan to do that. Then what? And then they have to abide by all the rules within the warranty easement deed, which means they can't graze or mow or build things on it. One important thing is that the public does not have access to their property. It remains their own private property, but the restoration does happen and then they are able to enjoy it. We have a lot of hunters. We have a lot of wildlife people who restore these properties and love to just go out there and walk and take pictures, hike. And then we have others, some who actually have hunt clubs, and you can charge a fee to the public to hunt on the property, and you can let the public access the property as long as they're not damaging it. So that's what some of the sites end up going for. This year's application cutoff is November 15th, so that's coming right up. Our local NRCS district conservationist, which we have one who represents each county, take those applications, and the landowner will provide a deed, property deed, to show that they actually own the property, and then talk about which areas of the property they want to enroll. And that's what would have to be done by November 15th. Said I would mention quickly some other programs. So if you don't have 15 acres and you don't want to enroll in a permanent program or a 30-year program, there are some other options. Environmental Quality Incentive Program and Conservation Reserve Program are two programs for natural resources that NRCS does implement, provide technical assistance for. They do have, these two programs have practices that range from forestry to cover crops, wetlands, all kinds of things, and they have shorter duration, 10-year contracts and agreements that you can go into. So that's an option. I want to mention U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a great Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, which they also will restore wetlands and work with private landowners and state and local governments to do that. Theirs is a little bit different, in fact, in the fact that theirs is between a 10 and 30-year agreement. So there's no permanent easement on that, but theirs is a payment share program. So they do expect that the landowner is going to supply some of the cost or some of the input for that, but they do work hard to try to find other partners to help incentivize landowners to do that. The Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, we call CREP, is a program that is shared between the USDA and the state Indiana Department of Agriculture. Julie Harold is the manager for that, and this is a 15-year wetland restoration project that landowners could be a part of. And again, that one is an agreement, so it's not a permanent easement. It's not an easement at all. For those who are not ready for a permanent easement, there are other options. And this is a map where the CREP areas exist. Now, I do need to mention, at least for all of the NRCS, and I know for the CREP program, these are programs where the landowners put in an application, but they are competitive. So we only get so much money per year. I know for NRCS, for the WRE program, we usually get around $8 to $10 million a year. So I know last year we were able to fund 24 easements out of, I believe, 55 applications. I don't know what the farm ground and pricing this year, whether it will be quite as long of a list of applications, but we'll see. So they are competitive programs. We're looking for the best sites. So that is how those work. So I put my contact information on there. I also included a link to the NRCS District Conservationist list. If anybody is interested in WRE, you can contact me directly, and then eventually you would end up with your district conservationist to start the process. And I will send this to Indra. I believe she's going to try to share some information by email, possibly after the webinar.
Yes, thank you, Beth, so much. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with useful links and, of course, a link to the recording of the webinar as well. It's wonderful to hear about the efforts at the state level and with our land trusts, as well as the, excuse me, the federally funded programs that Beth just touched on. They give me hope, you know, when you hear about all of these acres that are actually being restored and protected. But advocacy also has a role, and that's part of my job. So my name is Indra Frank. I'm the Environmental Health and Water Policy Director for the Hoosier Environmental Council. The Hoosier Environmental Council has been around since 1983, working on Indiana's environmental issues. A big part of our job is tracking the bills at the State House that have an environmental impact. And as we saw this year, the State House can have a big impact, right? The Wetlands Bill significantly reduced protection for state wetlands. We know that policy changes at the State House have an important role, and that's why advocacy has an important role. The legislature will start up again in January for the 2022 session. We've already heard about some topics that may become bills. Representative Boy from the Northwest Indiana is working on a tax incentive bill that would incentivize wetland preservation. We know that there's a budget surplus, and there's already a conversation started about using part of the surplus potentially for conservation. But we also have to watch out for bills that are damaging. There could be more anti-wetlands bill, giving the strength of the sentiment that we saw in the debate over the wetlands bill this year. We're concerned that there are some legislators who might be interested in removing the in lieu fee program. Carl just shared with us at the top of this webinar all of the value of that state restoration program. So we want to make sure that our legislators know that, you know, we need to keep that. We've also heard through an article in Prairie Farmer Magazine and a postcard lobbying effort that apparently there are some people out there who want to target DNR's construction in a floodway permitting program. These bills, if they are introduced, will be revised and voted on by our legislators. The Indiana Legislature has a House with 100 representatives and a Senate with 50 senators, and these people represent all of us. So no matter where you live in Indiana, you are represented by one representative and one senator. And I should say state representative and state senators, as opposed to the folks who go to Washington, D.C. in Congress. It's not hard to find your legislator if you're not sure who they are. You simply search on the internet with this phrase, Indiana, find my legislator. That should bring up this web page. It's a web page where up in the top left you see Indiana General Assembly. It's the General Assembly web page. And it has an area called Find Your Legislator where you can enter your address and click search, and it will tell you who your legislators are and how to contact their offices. You can also find out more about individual legislators, including your own, on the more complete Indiana General Assembly website, iga.in.gov. Up in the right-hand corner, there's a tab called Legislators that will allow you to search for any of the legislators and find out more about them, like how to email them, what their biography is, and what bills they've been working on. It's important to get to know our legislators. You can contact them, by phone, email, or arrange for time on Zoom. It's possible to meet in person. You can request a meeting at their office, or maybe meet them for coffee in the district. Take them for a wetland tour, or take them for a tour of a nature preserve that's in the district. And many of our legislators participate in third house or town hall meetings, where there are opportunities for them to hear from their voters and an opportunity to meet in person. Developing a relationship with your legislators is worthwhile, because then they get a better sense of what their voters want in their district, but they might also get a better sense of who they can get reliable information from. And you may have expertise on wetlands or other environmental topics that you can share with them. A couple of tips on getting to know your legislator. One is it's helpful to contact them more than once. So if you are able to see them at a town hall or meeting for coffee, follow up with a thank you email. Contacting them more than once means that you get better acquainted, they get better acquainted with you, but it also lets them know that this is one of their voters who's not just going to go away. And then, of course, contacting them before the legislative session starts is helpful, in that when they're outside of the legislative session, they actually have more time for getting acquainted and for hearing about their voters' concerns. And of course, we have to contact them during the legislative session so that we can tell them, as their constituents, how we would like them to vote on bills that we're interested in. The Indiana legislative session runs for the first few months of each year. So the January session will run the 2022 session will run from January to March in 2022. So wetland topics that you might want to talk about if you do meet with your legislator. One is just to talk about the value of wetlands and floodplains. Our legislators, of course, have other jobs the rest of the year, and they have a wide variety of expertise. Some of them are educators, some are in business, some are lawyers. There are very few of them who have really a well-developed knowledge of ecosystems and natural resources. So you may be able to share information that will be useful to them when it comes time for them to vote on a wetland or a floodplain issue. You can also talk to them about where you stood on this year's wetlands bill, SB 389. Whether or not you agreed with how they voted, our legislators need to know how their voters feel about wetlands. You can also share with them the value of the Indiana Wetlands Task Force. This task force has just been formed. The governor announced the appointments about a month ago, and it has the task of actually reviewing Indiana's wetland regulation and wetland permitting to come up with recommendations for how things ought to be in the future. There are a lot of really smart people on this wetlands task force who know a lot about wetlands. So it'd be good to encourage our legislators to listen to the recommendations that come out of the task force. Other topics, tell your legislator that you think the in lieu fee program is beneficial. Like I said, we heard honestly some misinformation during the last session that was highly critical of the in lieu fee program, and yet it's a substantial benefit to the businesses that need wetland permits, and they're doing great restoration for us. You might also put in a plug for using some of the budget surplus for conservation. So those are topics you could bring up with legislators. I also wanted to mention that every year the Hoosier Environmental Council tracks environmental bills, and we keep a bill watch page on our website. We also have an annual conference on environmental policy in Indiana. It's called Greening the State House, and it's coming up November 19th and 20th. Registration is now open on the Hoosier Environmental Council website. Emily mentioned that we're planning a follow-up webinar probably in late January, and at that point we'll be able to talk about what bills have been introduced in the legislative session. But there's also a webinar coming up on November 11th called How to Watchdog Wetland and Water Permits. It'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and registration is available on the Hoosier Environmental Council website under events. This webinar is intended to train people who are interested in tracking and commenting on permits. The permitting process for wetlands and for water discharges and for a number of other things related to our waterways are matters of public interest and all have public comment periods built into them. And well-written public comments can influence the way these permits are written. So for people who either on the staff of your organization, or if you've got dedicated volunteers, people who have a good eye for detail and are willing to do the heroic task of slogging through permit application documents, this webinar is for them. So with that, I want to hand back to Emily. Oh, hang on.
Thanks, Indra.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for sticking with us. We are, of course, a little bit over already, but let's go ahead and dive into some of the questions that we had. I've got them here on a list. Carl, I think there were a couple for you. I'm not sure if you went back and looked at the chat, but there was one from John Paul McCool, a question about how ILF credits compare in the cost to mitigation bank credits. Were you able to see that question?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Emily. It's hard to say because mitigation banks are being, run by private companies, and they don't publish or post their prices per credit anywhere that I have ever seen. So I've heard a range, about what we're charging. So 80 to 120,000, kind of depending on, and they don't have to set prices. So if somebody comes in and wants to buy a huge number of their credits that they have available, they could give them a break on the per credit price, as opposed to somebody coming in looking for just, a quarter of a credit or a half a credit. So, but being a public agency, we post our prices and, are being transparent about what we're charging. So, I think there were a couple questions in there, Emily.
Yeah, he asked about what the project time delay between selling credits and getting sufficient funds to complete construction.
Yeah. It's a hard question to answer. Of our 11 service areas, like the credit sale traffic, for lack of a better way to describe it, has been very variable across those 11 service areas. In the Upper White service area here in central Indiana, we have sold a large number of credits, more than half of them to INDOT for a few of their larger projects that they've got going on right now. So, and then some of our other service areas have been a lot slower in selling credits. So, but generally, we're doing everything we can to meet that 3 growing season requirement of the 2008 federal mitigation rule. So we've submitted 2 projects in the Upper White service area already, concept plans at this point. We have a number of concept plans in the other service areas that we hope to get in front of the agencies in the next several months or early next year. And so we sold credits in 2018. Granted, it was just the last quarter of that calendar year, in 6 of the 11 service areas. I think we sold credits in all but one of them in 2019, and that was the Maumee, which did sell some credits in 2020. So we have sold credits in all the service areas as of 2020. So, so the time frame, is hopefully we'll be turning dirt on our first projects sometime later next year in the Upper White service area, and then a bunch of the other ones to follow.
Great. He had a specific question about the project in Porter County. Do you know anything about that one?
Yeah, it's we're working with the Shirley Hines Land Trust. They recently acquired a property about a year ago, and it is, it does have some existing pretty nice wetlands on it, but the majority of the property has been in agriculture, and they have had a farm lease currently going on at the property, and it does have some wetland and stream restoration potential. It's in Porter County. It's adjacent to some of their other land holdings. It's also adjacent to our Reynolds Creek game bird habitat property up in the county. So,
thanks. This is a question from Patrick Wiltshire. I think it was originally to Carl, but I imagine that Indra might also be able to answer this. He was asking if there's a coordinated effort in Indiana to inventory all of the state regulated wetlands that are being filled or developed as a result of SB 389.
We've asked IDEM that question, and the answer was essentially no, that the state agency isn't doing that. I mean, it's possible to look at the permit applications to see where people are applying for wetland permits, but it's not. There really isn't a way to tabulate instances where people look at, you know, the wetlands law that was passed this year, and they just assume, oh well, that means, you know, I don't have to get a permit, and they go ahead and destroy their wetland. That's so. I guess, long story short, it's going to be really difficult to know overall what the impact of SB 389 winds up being. And then the impact of that bill was also made somewhat less when a court decision came out at the end of August saying that, in fact, more wetlands are federal than used to be. And you know, our SB 389 wetlands law can only apply to our state wetlands. So there was some reduction in the harm of the bill when that court decision came out.
Great. Thanks. Well, we have just a couple minutes here. I have some questions directed to Beth. Heather Parsons asked if there, with the 30-year easement, can the landowner convert it back to agriculture with no penalty after that 30 years is over?
Yes, they can. So, well, maybe should be the answer, because as you can imagine, if it's been in a wetland for 30 years, there are probably going to be some regulations that are going to apply to it that are outside of what the NRCS requirements would be. So there are no requirements from us, but I can tell you it hasn't been 30 years yet for any of our easements to come out of the program. And now several of the ones that were originally signed up as 30-year easements have converted to permanent easements. So they were able to get that additional amount of money to convert them to permanent. I mean, that's a great question. That's probably a good question for Carl or some of the others who look at state and permitting requirements more, that probably when they come out of that 30-year easement, it's going to be still considered a regulated wetland.
Great, thanks. Probably the last question here before we get close to 5:15 and cut everyone loose. You might be able to answer too quickly here. Julia Borgman asked Beth what the crop history requirement is for the WRE, and then Indra also asked if there are compliance problems with property owners in the wetland easement program.
Yeah, I can answer those pretty quickly. So crop history for eligibility for the program, we can look back if it was ever cropped ever. So we look back at old aerial photos. It could have been cropped back in the 20s. For the ag land rates to receive the higher rates, it has to have been cropped within the last 10 years. So we're looking for recent cropping for that ag land rate. And then as far as compliance problems, you know, we have over 900 easements. I would say I deal with about 10 violation type of issues per year, which I think is pretty low compared to the number of easements. But when you consider we send a letter, we call, and we visit all these easements almost every year, we're in close contact. And so we really, really spend a lot of time with those landowners to ensure that they're not doing things that they're not supposed to.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the great questions from our listeners here looking to engage in wetlands issues. We really appreciate you being here. Again, we're going to send a follow-up email. Any of the questions that didn't get answered here, we'll try to answer in that follow-up. We'll include links to all of the speakers, how to get a hold of them, and the programs that they were talking about. Last thing I would just like to mention, if you're looking to get involved with something, one of the best things that you can do is join something. There's a number of great organizations here that need your support and that are doing all of these things on your behalf already. The Indiana Wildlife Federation, Hoosier Environmental Council, ILPA, all of these great organizations are out doing this work. And one of the best things that we can do is say how many people support our work when we go and talk to legislators. So consider joining an organization like this and supporting presentations and webinars and educational opportunities for us to all keep all of our everything sharp in our minds so that we're ready to answer questions and try to protect wetlands and wildlife wherever we can. Thank you all for joining us. We will be in touch regarding following webinars and ways that you can help us elevate these messages. Thank you again for joining us.